Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today on Navy Sports Central. I'm your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. In this episode, we'll get you caught up on the Army-Navy Star Series, including that huge sweep that took place this past weekend. The Mids began last Saturday morning trailing in the competition by 2, and by Saturday night, they were leading by 2. So we're going to go ahead and do our best to cover all the top performances from those 4 events. We'll also have our new Ask Me Anything segment and our question of the day, and we'll check in with our 2 athletes on the Mid-Watch. There's lots to talk about as the winter sports season heads towards the finish line, so stay with us. All right, it is great to be back with you all, and I'm going to apologize right off the bat for being somewhat out of pocket lately. For those of you who may not know, I do a little bit of part-time work as a substitute teacher for junior high students at my kids' old charter school, mostly science and math, and it's usually only about 10 days a month. But right before Christmas, I filled in at one of the other campuses for a couple of days because their junior high math teacher was sick. And then 2 days later, I get a call back from them asking if I'd be interested in the job on a more permanent basis. So After I stopped laughing, I told them that I was basically retired and just helping out here and there whenever a teacher needed some coverage. But even though I wasn't interested in a full-time gig, I did tell them that I would cover the assignment for 3 days a week until they got somebody hired permanently. And that commitment ate up a little bit more time than I thought it was going to, but the school did get somebody hired, and he started this week. So that's what's been taking up all my time and messing with the production schedule of the podcast. Things should be back to normal here in just a matter of days, and I can get back to getting something out to you guys every 2 weeks or so. Okay, that's what's been going on with me lately. Let me go ahead and get through a sports update for you, and I'm going to focus on Navy track, rifle, and gymnastics in the deep dive segment. So let's take a look and see what's going on with some of the other winter sports. I'm going to lead with the wrestling team. They are coming off a win over Bucknell this past Saturday, and they currently have a 3-1 conference record. The Mids will be wrapping up their dual season with their star match against Army up at West Point on February the 19th. So with 10 more stars still up for grabs, that one in wrestling is going to be critical for the Mids to win if they want to take the series. Anyway, that win Saturday gave the Mids their 21st in a row over the Bison. They earned victories in 7 of the 10 weight classes to take the meet by a score of 25-9. They got off to a great start, winning their first 4 matches. At 165, Val Park beat Riley Bauer 4-0. Next up at 174 was Sammy Starr, and he took care of his opponent Sam Barnes 6-2. Cale Krebs was next, and he kept things going at 184 pounds by earning a 7-4 decision over Mason McCready. And then at 197 pounds, 26th-ranked Jacob Kozer picked up his 75th career win by shutting out Nolan Springer 6-0. Kozer's win was also his 21st of the season, and that's good for a third on the team behind junior Grady Grice with 26, who wrestles at 285 pounds, and Josh Coderhan with 22 at 141 pounds. Now, there is one freshman I wanted to let you all know about. I think I mentioned him briefly in either the last episode or maybe it was the one before, and his name is Brendan Ferretti from Macomb, Michigan. Right now, he's got an 18-7 record, and he wrestles at 133 pounds. Freddie was a 2-time state champion in high school, and just to give you an idea of how mentally tough this kid is, we just need to go back to his senior season just a couple years ago. First of all, he almost didn't have one at all. During the summer between his junior and senior year, he broke his foot after getting it caught in between a truck liftgate and the truck itself. In fact, I'm pretty sure he said he broke his heel in the interview that I heard. Anyway, he missed most of the season. I think they said he came back in February to wrestle, but he managed to get himself in shape enough to qualify for the state tournament, and then ended up winning that. In fact, I actually found some video of that finals match, and the one thing I can say is that guy is lightning quick. He dominated his opponent from start to finish, and you could just tell from his interview after the match that he's got a boatload of confidence. Now, when he goes up against Army in a couple of weeks, Ferretti will likely take on a guy named Richard Triner. He is a sophomore, and he currently has a 15-6 record. So that looks like it's going to be one of the key matches in that star meet. Another big match may come at 157 pounds. Navy's Andrew Cerniglia is the likely choice to get that assignment. He is a junior who has 2 star meet wins to his credit already, but this year he suffered an injury after getting off to a great 5-0 start. I'm not sure what he hurt, but it was bad enough to force him to withdraw from the Navy Classic back on November the 19th. And this was after Cerniglia won the Bearcat Open the previous weekend. I'm guessing the injury may have had something to do with those most recent losses, but he did get back into the win column a couple of weeks ago against Lehigh. Niglia did sit out the last 2 meets against Lockhaven and Bucknell, so hopefully he'll be 100% in time for Army. The other team I wanted to get you all caught up on is the women's tennis team. They got their season started pretty early for a spring sport. It's now just early February, and they've already played 7 matches. After dropping the first 2, the Mids have won 5 in a row, and they haven't even really been close. Neither St. Joseph's nor Towson this weekend managed to earn a point against them, and even before that, St. Bonaventure was shut out 7-0 as well. The Mid's current number 1 singles player is Emily Tannenbaum. She is a sophomore from Commack, New York, which is on Long Island, about 45 miles east of New York City. Tannenbaum won both of her matches this weekend, and she lost only 4 games in the process. She also teamed with Samantha Johns to win a doubles match against St. Joseph's on Saturday. As I mentioned, Tannenbaum is just a sophomore, and she's had an immediate impact since arriving at Annapolis last year. She was named First Team All-Patriot League and earned Rookie of the Year honors as well. So it's great having that kind of experience in a second-year player. Last season, the Mids came up just a little bit short in the Patriot League championships, but based on what I've seen so far, they look like a pretty good bet to go deep into the tournament. And the extra year of experience could be just enough to get them to the title match and possibly the championship. Okay, those were the 2 main sports I wanted to make sure that everybody was up to speed on, and now we're just going to roll right into our next segment, which is Ask Me Anything. So let's take a look and see what we have in the way of questions. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. The number of questions were a little on the light side. In fact, they were actually a lot on the light side. I went through the comments for about the last 3 weeks, and I only saw one question. It was from a post that I made about the wrestling team last week. And the question came from Doug Conkey, and he asked it on a Saturday, but since my Monday post didn't get out until it was late on the East Coast, I just figured, what the hell, I'm going to go ahead and use this one to get things started. Anyway, Doug's question was related to Navy's win over Hofstra and Binghamton, and specifically, he was wondering why there wasn't any video coverage. The question he asked was, is there a reason USNA Sports hardly ever posts video recaps of the wrestling matches? The 2 this weekend would have been great to see in terms of the energy that went towards Navy making these 2 comebacks. So, Doug, I appreciate the question. I'm actually planning on reaching out to the guy in Navy Sports Information who is responsible for covering wrestling. Turns out he is an intern, which probably answers part of your question already. I don't imagine he's got a ton of juice when it comes to requesting resources. But the one real reason you may not see much of a difference in this area, at least coming down the road, is because of the departure of Phil Bergman. I'm not sure how many of you guys were familiar with his work, but he was the guy in the department who produced those Navy 90 features, and that's where he gave a brief recap of all the sports in season in about a minute and a half, particularly ones that were played the previous weekend. Bergman was offered a position as Associate Athletic Director for Creative Services at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I know he's going to do a great job there, but I'm going to miss his different features, which also included one called the Student Athlete Spotlight. I really enjoyed watching that because one of the things he's really good at is asking off-the-cuff questions that just kind of pop up during the course of a conversation. So towards the end of his interview with the Mids, a lot of times Bergman would just start asking these little rapid-fire questions, and then just based on the answer, he would immediately come up with a different one that probably wasn't scripted. It just looked like he came up with it off the top of his head, just based on what the athlete answered. So, Doug, in response to your question, until that intern responsible for Navy wrestling sharpens up his videotaping and commentary skills, I don't think we're going to see much of a change there. I think the best we can hope for in about a week, with respect to video anyway, is when Navy takes on Army up at West Point on the 19th. ESPN Plus will be carrying that meet. Okay, now, like I said, the questions didn't exactly come at me nonstop as I got ready to record this segment. I did post another request this morning asking for a couple more, but in the event I don't get any, I do have a backup source for questions, and his name is W.T. Dorr. So I know that anybody who went to the academy knows exactly who I'm talking about. So Mr. Dorr actually had one really good question, and here it is. He says that Navy football has a new offensive coordinator. Ty Lavatai is still recovering from an ACL tear, and Xavier Arline is playing lacrosse right now. Do you see any other players potentially entering the quarterback picture and making some noise during spring practices? Mr. Dorr, I've got to tell you that is a very good question. So let's go ahead and try and answer that one piece at a time. First, we know the new offensive coordinator, Grant Chestnut, is committed to using the passing game a lot more. And of course, with him being new, I think we can assume that the quarterback competition will be pretty much wide open. Now let's take a look at what we know about each quarterback's ability to throw the ball. At least to me, there's no question that Lavatai has been consistently better. He's completed exactly half of his passes in his career. That's, I think, 76 for 152 for just over 1,200 yards. And he's also had 10 touchdown passes and 5 interceptions. Arline is 15 for 41 so far for 254 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Now, I have seen him throw some very nice passes, but I think overall, Lavatai seems to do it a little bit more consistently. The only problem is he won't be ready for spring practices because he's still rehabbing that knee. I have no doubt that he's probably already devoured Coach Chestnut's playbook, and the same is likely true for Arline as well. Now, while Lavatai won't be on the field due to injury, Arline won't be there as much either because during the spring he's playing lacrosse. And by the way, he's off to a really good start too. Through 2 games, he's got 2 goals and 3 assists, and he plays attack. The point I'm trying to make here is I know Arline is perfectly capable of improving his passing skills even more. We all know that throwing the ball was not Malcolm Perry's strength when he first began playing quarterback as a freshman and a sophomore, and he hadn't really progressed that much as a junior either, but he really got after it after that loss to Army in 2020 and turned himself into a pretty good passer as a senior. He completed 48 of 86 passes, which is almost 56%, and he went for over 1,000 yards, 7 TDs, and 3 interceptions. He also averaged 12.5 yards per attempt. So overall, for an option quarterback, I'd take those numbers any day. But one of the reasons Perry progressed so nicely was because football was the only sport on his plate, and that's not the case with Arline. He's a key player on the lacrosse team, and he's trying to pick up a new offensive system in football at the most demanding position. Arline has committed to being with the football team during spring practices in addition to playing lacrosse. I'm just not sure how that's going to work. I'm not doubting his energy to be able to do that. I'm just thinking that there are just so many hours in a day. So we've got one proven starter in Lavatai who's still recovering from an injury, and Arline, who may not throw the ball as consistently but is a faster and more elusive runner, is planning on doing double duty between football and lacrosse in the spring. Now the question becomes, does that open the door for anyone else to be considered? One interesting prospect was a kid named King Benford. He was a freshman last season, and he's from the same part of Florida as Lavatai. Elkton, Florida is about 45 miles south of Jacksonville. And Benford goes a solid 5'10", 200 pounds, and the word was that he threw pretty well. The only problem is he's not on the roster anymore. My guess is he left after Coach Ken's departure. Maybe he'd made that decision long before everything went down. I don't know one way or the other, but I know that Benford did get offers from several other schools, including South Florida and UAB, so if he wound up at one of those 2 places, we may end up seeing him again at some point. Now, as I continued looking through the roster, I came across another rising sophomore by the name of Drayvon Ponder. This guy's built along the lines of Lavatai. He is 6'1" and 230 pounds. But one difference here is he is a really good sprinter. At least he was in high school. And I caught some film on him his senior year, not just on the track, but also on the football field. He definitely has the ability to run away from people, and he's got a really good arm, too. On one pass I saw, he faked going right and rolled back to his left, and by the way, he's right-handed. So he was looking to run, and that got shut down. So in a split second, he stopped on a dime and got his hips pointed back to the right, and then he hit his receiver about 15 yards downfield. On another play, he hit this guy in stride from the pocket on about a 30-yard skinny post. The receiver basically just ran it right up the seam, and Ponder delivered it right on time and right on target. So he's one guy worth keeping an eye on. I guess what remains to be seen is what his decision-making looks like when it comes to running the option. But even if it's not quite there, he's still only a sophomore. And that means if he decides to stay after Lavatai and Arline graduate, he could wind up being the guy. But there are also a couple other rising sophomores that might get on the coaching staff's radar. They are Tedros Gleaton and Blake Horvath. Gleaton is 6'1", 214, and Horvath goes 6'2", 195. Gleaton came from more of a passing-oriented offense in high school. Looked like a lot of RPO-type stuff. He completed almost 56% of his passes for nearly 1,500 yards and 23 touchdowns. He also averaged 4 yards a carry. Horvath was more of a runner, and during his senior year, he gained over 1,700 yards on 234 carries, which worked out to a pretty impressive 7.4 yards every time he touched the ball. He didn't throw the ball that often, though. Turns out he was 26 of 65 for 515 yards his senior year, and he also threw for 5 touchdowns. So those are your potential candidates for quarterback right now. We'll definitely know a lot more after spring practices are over. It's pretty clear that the coaching staff can't wait to get after it, and no doubt the players feel the same way. And as a fan, I kind of feel like I'm waiting for Christmas to get here. So it'll be pretty interesting to see what's under the tree in a few months' time. We'll be right back. All right, it is time for our deep dive segment. And as I mentioned in the opening, all 4 Navy teams came through against Army this past weekend with a star on the line. There were some incredible performances across the board. And I wanted to share just a few of them with you because unless you're the parent of an athlete on one of these teams or you're just a sports junkie like I am, you probably don't know about them. This was one of the main reasons I started both the Navy Sports Nation blog and this podcast. So let's take a look at some of these athletes who were responsible for that clean sweep this past Saturday. We're going to go ahead and start with the rifle team since they were the ones that got things going. They had a 9 o'clock start that morning. Historically, Army has had the edge in this matchup. In fact, they still lead the series 47-35, but the Mids have come out on top in 3 of the last 4 contests, and they've also taken the last 2 in a row. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have really watched any of these rifle matches live, and I haven't either, but I have jumped online to watch the live stream. And the first thing you realize is that it's not your typical spectator sport. There's not a lot of wild cheering going on, obviously. In fact, except for the sound of the rifles firing, there's practically no noise at all. The athletes compete in the small bore event first. They have 105 minutes to complete 6 rounds of 10 shots each. So if they use all of their time, that works out to be about 1 minute and 45 seconds for each shot. The other thing to remember is that each shooter has to take these shots from the kneeling, prone, and standing positions, and I believe they do go in that order, 20 shots apiece. Then after a short break, they move on to the air rifle competition, and here they've got 75 minutes to complete all 6 rounds. So by the end of the match, the competitors have been at it for 3 hours, and they've fired 120 shots at a bullseye that looks no bigger than a dime from about the distance that they're firing from. And by the way, just so you know, the target is 50 feet away for a small bore and 10 meters for the air rifle. Now, what I find the most impressive is the level of mental concentration that these athletes have to possess. I mean, they got to be locked in for all 3 hours. And while most competitors rely on adrenaline to get them through a game, adrenaline is definitely the enemy here if you're competing in a rifle match. If you get amped up, your chances of hitting the 10 ring are practically 0. So the ability of these athletes to train themselves to be calm and focused for 3 hours of shooting is pretty amazing to me. And on Saturday, the Mids pulled together as a team to take down the Black Knights in pretty dominant fashion. They swept the top 5 positions in aggregate scoring. Leading the way was Marley Duncan and Parker Hayden, who finished tied with an aggregate score of 1182. And they were followed by Stephanie Milvain, who came in at 1173. And then Deontay Hayes and Clarissa Leyland were right behind her with identical scores of 1171. Now, of the 5, Leyland had the highest air rifle score. She was only 4 points off of a perfect score, posting an impressive 596. And it was also a big day for Deontay Hayes, who scored a personal best in the small bore with 580 points, and he matched his best performance as well in the air rifle with a score of 591. Marley Duncan and Parker Hayden have been the model of consistency throughout the season. In just about every single meet, they've been the team's top 2 finishers. But in order to close the deal in these big competitions, other team members have to step up. And Coach Mike Ante made a point of saying that it was both Hayes and Leyland who answered the bell with their performances and locked down the win for the Mids. So congratulations to Coach Ante and the entire Navy rifle team for taking the star against Army for the 2nd straight year. Good job, guys. Okay, next we're going to move on to gymnastics, and that was probably the most exciting match of the weekend in terms of drama. The Mids fought it out with the Black Knights all afternoon. They got off to a great start, grabbing the lead after the first rotation. They took the first 4 places in the floor exercises. Junior Caleb Hickey pulled down the highest execution score of 9.05, and then when you added that to the degree of difficulty score of 5.1, that was good enough to finish in the top spot. But it was still pretty early. The Black Knights came right back to take the lead after the pommel horse. So suddenly, heading into the rings, the Mids found themselves down by almost 2 points. It was 1.7 to be exact. Now, they did take 3 out of the 4 top spots in that event to cut the lead to just 1/10 of a point. Isaiah Drake turned in a personal best score of 14 points to win pretty comfortably. So with 3 rotations left, our Army was just barely hanging on to that lead. When the vault was completed, the situation had not changed at all. So the Mids still had to make up 1/10 of a point, and they only had 2 events left to get it done. So in gymnastics, just like in track and field, a team's depth can really play a big role in the outcome, and that's what happened here. In the parallel bars, which was the 5th rotation, they didn't win the event, but Matthew Petros took 2nd, while his teammates Vishal Mandava, Caleb Hickey, and William Champagne finished in a 3-way tie for 3rd. That was good enough for the Mids to take the lead by 1 4/10 points because by leveraging that depth, they were able to overcome the first place finish by the Army competitor. And then going into the final rotation, which was the high bar, again, Army ended up winning, but Hickey finished 2nd. Giovanni Gambatese tied for 4th. That helped keep the difference in the event to half a point, which gave the mids the meet by just 9/10 of a point. So it was a great come-from-behind win. And what was most impressive was the team got it done on the road, too. Connor Van Loo won the vault to join Caleb Hickey and Isaiah Drake as the mids' 3 individual winners. Now, in the past, a win by Army in gymnastics was almost considered automatic. They took the star 20 straight years between 1949 and 1969. But since then, the mids have made up a lot of ground. The win this year narrows the Black Knights' lead in a series of 45, 40, and 2. And it's the mids' 5th consecutive win. So at this rate, it may not be too long before they pull even. Tell you what, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll break down the Navy track team's total demolition of Army on both the men's and women's side. And then we'll explore one big reason why I think this series has swung clearly in the mids' favor over the past 8 to 10 years. This is Carl Darden, and you're listening to Navy Sports Central. Okay, now it's time to check out how the men's and women's track teams went up to West Point and completely dismantled the Black Knights last weekend. Now, overall, Navy does lead Army head-to-head. The men's record is 35-27-2, while the women hold a slight lead at 19-17. Now, usually these meets are pretty close. They would usually come down to about the last few events, and that's been true over the last 4 to 5 years, with maybe one exception. But at the end of the day, the mids have always had an answer for the Black Knights to earn the win. This year, both meets weren't that close at all. The mids jumped ahead early, and they kept their foot on the gas basically from start to finish. So when the meet was going on, I happened to be hanging out at my parents' house for a couple of hours, and every 5 minutes or so, I was glancing down at the Navy Athletics app just to see how both teams were progressing. Since the meet was up at West Point, they provided the scoring information, but they didn't give you a running total of that score after every event. So all I could do was just mentally note how often the mids either won an event or finished in 2 of the top 3 positions. And what I was noticing about 45 minutes to an hour in was that in just about every event, that turned out to be the case. The mids either swept the event, finished first and second, first and third, or even second and third. By the time they got to the mile, I had a pretty good idea that both the men and the women were going to win. The only question was going to be by how much. And the reason I felt that way was because the middle distance races were coming up, and those typically went in the mids' favor. And that's pretty much what happened. So what I didn't really know was how badly the mids had crushed the Black Knights until I read the recap later in the day. The men set a record for the number of points scored, winning 113-68. Jacques Guillaume was one of the key contributors there with wins in both the 200 meters and the 400 meters. And the women won 111.5 to 69.5 while setting a couple of meet records. Those came from Gia Anderson in the 60-meter hurdles and Emily Booten in the 3,000 meters. But I wanted to spend some time talking about an amazing triple that Molly Mangan pulled off. Mangan is the team captain, and she picked up wins in the 400 meters, the 60 meters, and the 200 meters. Even more incredible was the fact that she only had about 30 minutes to recover from the 400 meters before running that 60-meter dash. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with just how challenging the 400 meters is to run. It is basically a full sprint, so make no mistake about that. And even for the best conditioned athletes, those last 50 to 100 meters can be just pure misery. Now, I've had some experience running quarter-mile intervals, and by no means am I trying to put myself on the same level as these athletes, but I'm telling you that even at going at 75% effort, it was a real struggle. So you can imagine what's happening when they're going just full tilt. Now, consider the fact that Mangan won the 400 with a time of 56:17, and then she had to get ready for the 60-meter dash, which came up just 30 minutes after that. So not only did she have to keep from tightening up between races, she also had to stay sharp mentally because in that 60-meter dash, there is absolutely no room for error. If your concentration lapses even for a fraction of a second, you're going to get left in the blocks and your race is over basically before it even begins. So Mangan takes the 400, and then she manages to stay loose while keeping herself mentally dialed in to run the 60 meters, wins that less than 30 minutes later, and then closes out a terrific afternoon by crossing the finish line first in the 200 meters. That's just insane. And Navy Track and Field Director Jamie Cook said as much because he commented that he had never seen that kind of a performance in a dual meet. So that should tell you something right there. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about Molly Mangan, check out episode 40. I released that one about 3 months ago back in November. It's entitled Ending Bloodlines and Crushing the Competition. And by the way, that's Molly's quote. We had a great conversation, and she shared some really funny stories, too. So I'll go ahead and put a link for that in the show notes. And when you get some time, go ahead and pull it up. I think you'll really like it. So that covers Navy's sweep over Army last week in the Star Series. And now I want to get into some possible reasons why the mids have been so dominant in the competition, especially over the last 8 years. I'm going to look at this from the standpoint of the culture that the coaches have created and the athletes have bought into. Of course, first, it's all about having the right coach in place. And the one thing I've always given Chet Gladchuk credit for is his ability to find coaches who are the right fit for the Naval Academy. I've always recognized that, regardless of my thoughts of how he handled the situation with Coach Niumatalolo a couple of months ago. Gladchuk is committed to competing for league titles and beating Army consistently, and it doesn't even matter what the sport is or what stage of development it's in. Here's what I'm talking about. Back in 2006, so he had been on the job roughly 4 years. That's when the Naval Academy added lacrosse as its newest women's sport. Gladchuk went all in with this program, and you didn't have to go any further than his choice to coach the team to figure that out. He wasn't interested in bringing in a first-time coach on an entry-level salary. Instead, he went out and basically hired a legend. Somehow, he convinced Cindy Timchall to leave the University of Maryland after winning multiple national championships to become the first head coach of the Navy women's lacrosse team. Timchall quickly built the program into a contender, too. They were competing for Patriot League titles within 3 years, and beginning in 2010, the Mids won the first of 4 straight championships. Then, in 2017, they reached the Final Four of the NCAA tournament. I could point out some other examples, too. Let's go back to the Navy track team for a minute. They have had a good amount of success against the Army over the years, but they really started to get some separation ever since Jamie Cook came on board in 2017. Prior to arriving in Annapolis, Cook was the assistant coach at Oregon, whose program is considered among the best in the country. And since he took over as men's coach and then later became the director of both teams, Navy track has a combined 14 Patriot League championships in indoor and outdoor track and earned a total of 13 stars in the Army-Navy series. But these coaches were brought on for more than just their coaching ability. They also have a strong commitment to the Naval Academy's physical mission, and across all sports, they've created a culture that is both competitive and unifying. For example, Coach Cook has put together practice sessions where the athletes compete with each other in several different ways, and the goal is to create a competitive environment in practice so that the team members can carry that attitude into the meet. And on the swim team, Coach Bill Roberts has done the same thing. During practices, a swimmer can challenge a teammate to a race at any specified distance in an effort to climb up the ladder and earn a spot to race in the next meet. I could go through some more examples, but I think you get the idea. It's really not the easiest thing in the world to build a competitive culture while you're trying to maintain a strong, cohesive team where all the athletes support each other. But that's what the coaches have accomplished at the Academy, and I think it's one reason why Navy has consistently had the upper hand in the Star Series. I don't know that West Point necessarily operates the same way. And I think the best example I can give for that is when I go back to an interview that I heard Navy linebacker Diego Fagot give right after the Mids upset Army in 2021. A reporter had asked him his thoughts on the difference between the two programs. And Fagot responded by saying this. He said that our program is one where we all compete against each other in practice really hard, and we built a culture based on the fact that we love each other and play for the brother next to us on game day. Army's culture just seems to be based on hating Navy. So that happens to be how at least one athlete sees things. And I happen to agree because, I mean, when you think about it, creating that kind of a competitive environment and pulling for your own teammates is going to be a whole lot more productive than just hating the other guy. So I do think it's this difference in culture that has led to Navy's success in the Army-Navy series over the last several years especially. They are focused inward and lifting up their own teammates and having that strong and positive sense of competition. Whereas on the Army side, at least from everything that I've heard from different athletes, is that everything is projected outward. I mean, their main motivation is based on how much they dislike Navy. And, I don't care what anybody said. That's just not a healthy way to go. Now, before I move on, I did want to take one quick look at something that most of us probably never think about, and that's how both Army and Navy cover their respective teams. Look, I'm not saying that this has anything to do with Navy's success in the Star Series, but it does say something about the level of commitment each school's sports information department has towards their athletes. And to show you what I'm talking about, I'm just going to pick 2 sports. And by the way, they're not going to be one of those big ticket sports like football or basketball. I'm going to go with 2 that you don't hear too much about. So I'm going to pick track and field and wrestling. The goal here is to look at both the Army and Navy sports websites and check out how much information I can find on each of these teams. So I'm going to start with track and field. And when I went to the Army website, this is what I was able to dig up. For both teams, that being the men's and women's team, they had a top 10 list for both the indoor and outdoor season. The indoor list was about 8 pages long for each team, and the one for outdoor track was 8 pages for the men and a little bit longer for the women. Theirs was 13 pages. And then they had a list of total program records, which was basically just a one-pager that covered both teams. And what you saw there was a list of team members and how many individual records they had. And finally, there was a 9-page record book for each team, but it hasn't been updated in 2 years. So when you put all that together, you get about 55 pages of information for both teams combined. Now, on the Navy website, this is what you'll find. The men have 8 pages worth of stats just for this season alone, and the women have 9 pages. Both teams have a link to the Track and Field Results Reporting Service website, and that basically just posts the best individual performances for the season through the most recent meet. And then finally, there is a 74-page media guide that covers both teams. It includes coaching and player profiles, a review of the last season, a record of the all-time indoor and outdoor best performances for each team, a list of all-time team captains, star team results for both teams, and it also provides a list of all-time achievements, both athletic and academic. And then finally, it shows records that have been set for the Wesley A. Brown Fieldhouse and also Ingram Field. So altogether, that comes out to be about 103 pages of information dedicated to Navy track and field. And by the way, I didn't mention that if you go into the archives section and go back to previous years, you'll be able to find media guides for Navy track going back, at least 10 or 15 years for sure. So there's your comparison for track and field. Now, when I looked at wrestling, here's what I found on the Army website. They just had 1 page of statistics for this year alone. Now, they did have a 41-page record book, and that seems to be the closest thing you can get to a media guide, although all it lists is just the records themselves. It does cover every season of Army wrestling, and it lists overall series results for every opponent. It also lists the top individual records and tournament winners and all-time letter winners as well. So that's the most I could find on wrestling for Army. Now, Navy has 25 pages worth of stats just for the current year. You can also go back into the archives and find those individual season results going back to 2014. And on top of that, they have an 80-page media guide. Those are also available going back to the 2005 season. So if you just look at this year alone, that's 105 pages of information that's dedicated to Navy wrestling compared to 42 for Army. And I'm sure the story will be the same across all the other varsity sports. So this is a point I'm trying to make. The Naval Academy has a sports information department that is totally committed to promoting all 35 sports and the athletes who compete in them. And based on those 2 examples I just gave you with track and field and wrestling, if the sports information department were part of the Army-Navy Star Series, it's pretty clear that Navy would win that one hands down also. All right, that does it for our deep dive. We'll be back to wrap things up with our question of the day and mid-watch segments. Stick around. Welcome back to Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and it is time for our question of the day. And as we always do, let's go ahead and check out the results from our last question. You'll recall that we were talking about the Navy offense, and here was the question. In 2019, the Mids averaged over 37 points per game on their way to an 11-2 record. Last season, that point production dropped to just under 22 points a game. With this increased focus on expanding the offense in 2023, how many points do you think Navy needs to put up in order to win 7 games? And our choices were 24 to 27 points, 28 to 32 points, 33 to 36 points, and more than 37 points. So when we break down the results, it looks like the biggest vote getter was 28 to 32 points at 68%. And then there was 18% of you that chose 24 to 27 points. 12% went with 33 to 36 points. And there were just 2% that figured it was going to take at least 37 points for the Mids to win 7 games. As for me, I'd probably go with that 28 to 32 point range. That seems pretty reasonable. You figure if you tack on an extra touchdown per game, that should get you at least 2 to 3 more wins anyway. So thanks to all of you who responded to that question. And actually, that had a pretty good turnout as well. I think there was at least 40 responders to that, so I really appreciate it. Okay, now let's get to our question for this episode. At the time of this recording, there are 10 stars left up for grabs in the Army-Navy series. Those are in men's and women's basketball, which will be contested this weekend in Annapolis, men's and women's outdoor track, men's and women's tennis, men's and women's lacrosse, and also wrestling and baseball. So the question is, knowing that Navy just needs 5 to clinch the Star Series, how many do you think they'll get? Your choices are A, less than 5, in which case that means they'll either lose or just tie at best at 12 apiece. B, 5 exactly. C, 6. D, 7, or E, more than 7. So I am definitely looking forward to seeing the responses to that question. And again, you can respond by going to the poll on the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. That'll be posted later on today. And you can also email me at carld@navysportsnation.com. All right, and finally, let's go ahead and check in with our athletes in the mid-watch segment. First of all, both the men's and women's swim teams finished up their dual seasons with 9-3 records. Next up for them will be the Patriot League Championships, and those are coming up on February the 15th. So remember, we were following Jonah Harm and Lauren Walsh. I'm just going to give you the results of Jonah's last dual meet against Columbia. He swam in the 200 medley relay, which Navy won. Jonah's teammates there were Pat Colwell, Jackson Schultz, and Austin Lockhart. And Harm also finished third by just a fraction of a second in the 100 butterfly. But the difference between first and third was barely a quarter second. It was 0.28 seconds. So that was a pretty good effort there. And in the 100 backstroke, he touched the wall just 0.4 of a second behind the winner, finishing in second place. And then finally, in the 400 freestyle relay, Harm, Garrett McGovern, Andrew Everett, and Austin Lockhart finished first. So since that last meet was over, and that was way back on January 21st, Harm has been busy preparing for the Patriot League Championships. Now on to Lauren Walsh. Her last dual meet was against James Madison, and it was against Richmond. And then right before that was with James Madison. So I'm just going to go cover both of those. Against James Madison, she ended up winning the 200 individual medley, the 200 breaststroke, and she finished second in the 200 freestyle. So a good accumulation of points there. Let's see, 9, 18. So 22 points there, and that resulted in a win over James Madison by just a couple of points. So that was pretty tight. And then against Richmond, looks like I just have results for her in just one event, which she won. It was the 100-yard freestyle, and she won with a time of 52.28 seconds. So not a bad freshman season for Lauren Walsh, and we'll see what she can do next week at the Patriot League Championships, which will be hosted by Bucknell University. That's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. We have been getting a great response to our question of the day, so if you want to jump in on that, just go to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. I will go ahead and pin it to the top so you won't miss it. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used in Navy Sports Central comes to you courtesy of Audio Jungle. This is a great site for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in the podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.